Fly me to the moon, I'll assimilate the stars. Let me see the Borg out there from Jupiter to Mars. In other words,
I'm the Borg Queen, and I will assimilate you. Resistance is futile.
hello interwebs, I hope you are doing well, and welcome to my review of the latest episode of Star Trek Picard, the halfway point to the season, episode 5, Fly Me to the Moon, which I sort of sang a weird rendition of for you there. It's obviously a reference to the Frank Sinatra song, which makes me think of old Vic Fontaine from Star Trek Deep Space Nine, though I don't think Fly Me to the Moon was ever played in that show, but definitely gets some play in this episode, which was a lot of fun. But before we get to all that fun stuff, we'll get into my spoiler-filled thoughts in just a minute, but staying spoiler-free up front, I thought this was another fantastic episode of this show. This season, again, just continually proves to me that this show is really digging into a lot of the themes of abuse, about parenthood, about getting involved with people, or whether or not to stay back and sort of watch things happen. It's very much like discussions of all these tangled ideas of, do we get involved? Do we let abuse happen? Do we let trauma perpetuate itself? And also touching upon themes of depression and anxiety, and I just really love this season for interweaving all of these themes through all of its different character arcs, and I think that is absolutely wonderful. I've heard some people who are also reviewing this show talk about the pacing of this season overall, that it is very, very slow. And I do agree. This is another episode where not a ton happens in terms of characters moving from A to B. There's a lot of discussions going on. However, I do think those discussions are pertinent towards getting at the themes of this show, and I really enjoy it for that. That being said, that does not mean that this episode is a slouch. I think that this episode starts to do a lot of the heavy lifting and sort of moving the storyline forward. We finally get some concrete answers to things that our characters have been looking for, without spoiling too much about, like, what are their goals in this century? What do they need to stop from changing? Who is the Watcher? Who are the big players within this universe? And perhaps for some, it took 4 episodes too long to get there, and I could totally understand that. But for me, I've been enjoying the slower pace of this show, allowing us to really dive into all of these themes and ideas. However, also on top of that, another thing that I really loved this episode for was its touching upon some really intriguing elements of Star Trek lore. Without spoiling too much, there's one very overt and obvious one relating to do with the character of the Watcher that we saw at the end of last episode that I was very excited to see. Very pumped about that. We'll talk about that in spoilers. However, there is the character of Brent Spiner playing another Soon ancestor, one of Arc Soon, the creator of Data's ancestors here, and that's a lot of fun to sort of see him coming back. But also, the way that he is utilized is also touching upon some interesting stuff with Star Trek lore, and not just to do with Data, and I think that is kind of intriguing to see where they're going to be going with that, but we'll talk more about that in spoilers. However, the one final thing that I do wish to say here is, although he is not in a ton of scenes this episode, John Delancey as Q is freaking-tastic. There are 2 scenes in this episode where he is just absolutely standout and terrifying, and it is a new version of Q, kind of echoing what we saw way back in episode 2 of this season, of Q kind of in a different place, something off from the depiction that we've seen him before, and it is terrifying in a really brilliant way, and I'm just absolutely adoring the very sparingly used but excellently used John Delancey this season. However, that is all my spoiler-free thoughts, so if you have not seen the episode yet, we're going to dive into spoilers right now. Alright, now that we're in spoilers, I've been holding this in, but I called it. So rarely do Jessie's, Star Trek lore theories pan out in these modern Star Trek shows, but I called it. The Watcher, who is apparently Laris, but not Laris, is actually related to the same people that Gary 7 was related to back in the original series episode Assignment Earth. As I spoke about in my last review, Assignment Earth was a backdoor pilot created by Gene Roddenberry for Star Trek the original series, which featured the character of Gary 7 as the sort of Watcher supervisor on Earth, sort of influencing events on Earth to make sure they headed in the right direction. And we get a confirmation here that this sort of Laris Watcher character is from that same organization. However, she is slightly different here in that she's not sort of looking after Earth as a whole, she is looking after a singular thread. So a little bit of a shifting or sort of expanding of that lore, but I'm so excited because that was a piece of Star Trek lore that I was always interested to learn more. But I also think that they smartly don't give us too many answers about that lore specifically. I mean, Laris does, I'm using Laris, I forget what her actual actual name is. But Laris does not reveal like the aliens that she is working for, but that she is part of this organization. So I like that it's giving us more lore to play with, but doesn't give us specific answers. I love it when shows do that, because sometimes when you learn too much about the mystery of something, then it kind of destroys it. I mean, we see something with that with like the Borg themselves within Star Trek. The more Borg information we got in shows like Star Trek Voyager, the less terrifying they became. And so I like that we're getting more answers here, but not too much. However, I also like that there's this mystery still going on of who this character is, because she looks like Laris but isn't Laris. And there's a few instances of that this episode where we have actors in roles in this 21st century that seem like they're there just to make sure that these actors get to still be part of this show, even though their typical like 25th century characters aren't around anymore. Though I think some of them work and some of them don't. But I think Laris is interesting to me because this is my guess, is that this whole arc that Picard sort of hints at her with is that he says like, you should get involved. You should get involved in like helping things instead of just watching things. So my guess is that this character actually is Laris, and that the Laris that we saw way in the future is actually someone who was assigned to Picard, like Jean-Luc Picard, and has taken Picard's own advice of getting involved, and that's why she has feelings for him, because she remembered Picard's own advice after this timeline manipulation. That's my guess. Maybe this will turn out to be a completely different character, but that's my guess, is that this is the same person, and that the Laris in the future, who has like Romulan ears and everything, is the same person who is now just a watcher for Jean-Luc Picard, who has been convinced by Picard himself to get involved in events instead of staying out of them. That's my guess. However, we do learn here during this conversation that this Laris Watcher character is here assigned to watch the character of Rene Picard, who is an ancestor Picard who is working on this Europa mission. And we start to get this idea that Rene Picard is the reason that Picard and crew needed to go back in time to stop events from shifting around them. We kind of got some confirmation of that with Q last episode. We definitely get more of it here. And so I like that we finally now have a goal for them to sort of shift around, because we see that Q is manipulating the timeline as the worst therapist ever, being like just like playing off of Rene Picard's imposter syndrome and depression. Again, leaning into these ideas of depression, abuse, and things like that this show has been hinting at. And I like that it's coming up here. And dear God, I would not want Q as a therapist. But the one thing that I will say about the storyline, while I do appreciate that it's finally giving us a goal with our characters, I do find it a little bit convenient that she is an ancestor of Picard specifically. I didn't think I needed that connection necessarily, that Picard had this like forgotten ancestor who was part of this big events in the timeline, even though we don't know specifically what she's related to, even though we know a little bit of information about like she influenced some stuff on a space mission that my guess is like inspired humanity to be better, whatever she did, in order to inspire humanity instead of to go on a fascist course, to go on a more Starfleet-esque course. But I didn't necessarily need it to be related to Picard. But that being said, overall, I really enjoyed finally getting this development in the timeline. However, speaking of events in the timeline, we also get Raffi and Seven rescuing Rios. And we get a little bit of an argument here at the beginning where Raffi wants to just gun in, go guns blazing, kill everybody, and, well, not kill everybody, but, like, use phasers in order to save Rios. But Seven saying, like, look, we can be smart about it, we don't want butterflies to go out. Which I found to be a bit frustrating, because Seven's plan, while smarter, wasn't going in with phasers ablazing, was to stop the Homeland Security bus and let people off. And while I am all on the side of, saying, screw ice sucks, but also it felt weird to me that it was like, well, wouldn't letting these people off the bus and just run and do their own thing affect the timeline as well? Because if you hadn't got involved, these people would have just been, deported or wherever they were being brought off to. And so I'm like, this feels like more of a butterfly effect than anything else, just letting these people go. But I understand the sort of hard place that this show was put in, because, like, you don't want to be like, oh, it's okay to just leave these people locked up. So, but I feel like the writers should have been able to kind of weave around that a little bit better than they ultimately did, because I was scratching my head being like, I think that's big butterflies there, my friends. But also we get, speaking of actors coming back, as I mentioned before, we have Evan Evangorian coming back here for a brief moment as Elnor, who Raffi sees, like, clearly, like, some sort of PTSD that she's experiencing here. And I think that this was a little bit forced. Again, it feels like just having there to lean into how Raffi's feeling and showing showing her mindset, but also just to have the actor be in the episodes for a little while until he eventually gets saved by the time travel shenanigans that we're going to have here. So ultimately I was like, oh, I was okay with it, but it was just sort of like, oh, okay. But speaking of actors being brought back here, we have over on this sort of larger end of things, Brent Spiner coming back as one of Data's creators' ancestors soon. This time, I believe Eric Soon is his name, which I can I just tell you, I know some people have a problem with it, but I love the ever-expanding Soon family tree. I mean, we have Soon, who created Data. We have his ancestor, Ark Soon, who was seen on Star Trek Enterprise, who was also interestingly interested in genetics, which we'll talk about in just a minute. We also had Alton Soon. We also have Lore and Data himself and the B4, all that look like Brent Spiner. I just like this like recurring joke in Star Trek that all of Soon's ancestors and Data-related people all look like Brent Spiner for some reason. I think that they do have strong genetics, I guess, is what's going on here. So I thought that was pretty funny, but I'm really intrigued by his character for a couple different reasons. First off, we see that he is involved in some sort of genetic experimentation, which has me intrigued because as we saw with the Soon on Star Trek Enterprise, the Soon family is somewhat involved with the eugenics wars. The eugenics wars being the sort of element of Star Trek lore that Khan is from, Khan Noonien Singh, speaking of Soon, and he, there's apparently this war in the past where humans were genetically altering themselves, and that was eventually outlawed, which eventually sort of had Khan go into space, leading to the events of Star Trek the original series and the Wrath of Khan.
I've been thinking. Perfecting humanity may not be possible. Cybernetics. Artificial life forms. Goodbye, Doctor.
And so I'm wondering what this show is going to do with relation to the eugenics wars, because there is a call out when the people are sort of telling Soon to stop doing genetics. They sort of kick him off of his projects. That they reference this like treaty that says that you can't do that. And within Star Trek lore, the eugenics wars were separate from World War III, which happens after this event. But eugenics wars would have already happened within the timeline, but clearly they didn't happen in our real world. So I'm curious to see if this is building up towards Soon somehow being involved with the start of the eugenics wars, or if this is still set after the eugenics wars and things like Khan. So I'm curious to see what they're setting up with that, but I'm liking that there is this setup with the eugenics wars here. And speaking of this, we also meet his daughter, who he clearly cares about and is very, very sick apparently, but looks like Soji, which has me a very couple questions here. Number one, again, I think this is just them bringing in the character to look like Soji so that we can have Issa Briones playing here, but it does work for me because I would assume that Data in the future maybe would have used a picture of one of his ancestors to create a version of his daughter that looked like Soji. So I think I can see that sort of having made sense within the canon to bring Issa Briones here, but I also do wonder, I wonder if maybe she's not actually his daughter, but what if she is an android like Data? We know the Soon family likes messing with genetics, likes messing with androids, so what if this Soon daughter isn't actually his actual daughter, but this sort of Soon android version of her? Because we do see when she gets this cure that Soon sort of like hesitates at describing her mother. It's like, oh yeah, she was always swimming, just like you. And so I'm curious if that's actually him hiding the fact that she does not actually have a mother. So curious to see how all that is going to shake out. But this does also lead me to my favorite scene in the entire episode, which was the appearance of John Delancey blackmailing Brent Spiner's Soon in order to give him the cure for his daughter. John Delancey in this scene was terrifying, like absolutely terrifying. Like he said, I am death. It was just so creepy, and you see him like he doesn't have his powers, so he's using his intelligence and determination to get things done. It was just so wonderful. And yet I like the hints that he still has some of his omnipotence. He said like in 17 seconds you're going to sit down, so we clearly get that he's still very knowledgeable, still has some form of his powers, just not being able to snap things. So I like seeing this Q without his powers and just being absolutely terrifying. And then there's also another moment where he is blackmailing Soon towards the end of the episode, where he says to Soon, like, the only way to be truly free is to not love anything, and what life would that be? And so this leads me to the question of, does that mean that Q loves something? What does Q love? It seems like he's speaking from experience. Is it Picard? Is it Picard that he loves? Are we getting the Picard-Q romance that I've always wanted? Probably not, but still, maybe think about all of that. So just all the stuff with John Delancey was fantastic. But speaking of gay romances here, one final thing to talk about is we get the Borg Queen and Gerardi storyline. super being developed here in a really fun way that I am so excited about. Number one, the Borg Queen, like, using people's voices and everything in order to get a police officer to show up to rescue her, was super creepy, super cool to see. But then Gerardi confronting the Borg Queen and supposedly shooting her, I thought was interesting, but you do see that the Borg Queen is being manipulative and playing off of Gerardi's, like, kind of interest and depression and loneliness. Again, tying to these themes of melancholy, depression that we've seen woven throughout the season, and her wanting to reach out to get connection. Again, going to my theory that I think Gerardi might end up being the Borg Queen by the end of the season, but I like the Borg Queen sort of manipulating that emotion to the point where while Gerardi shoots her, she does get partially assimilated by the Borg Queen, which is so interesting to see. And we see at the end of the episode when Gerardi and team go into the gala to try to meet up with Renee Picard and influence events around her, the Borg Queen is in her head. And that was just, that was so creepy and so cool, and I am so intrigued by how this is going to play out. I am so here for it, and I'm loving, again, the themes of connection, loneliness, depression, that are all being weaved in through Gerardi's character along with the rest of the season here, that I just thought was absolutely so cool to see. And again, I really think that Gerardi is going to become the Borg Queen, but a good Borg Queen, because I think the next few episodes are going to see Gerardi wrestling with the Borg Queen. Borg Queen's going to take over her body and things like that, but I think Gerardi will be able to push back and fight her out, but still want to remain part of the collective and Borg. That's my theory. We'll see how it's just a Borg theory. So we'll see how that all eventually plays out towards the end of this. But that's my thought going into this. But that does bring us to the end of the episode where we have our characters breaking in to a gala. I also loved when Picard showed up on the ship with Laris. He's like, they're the best crew ever, and they're just dragging a dead body. I like that the show is able to find moments of humor within all of the darker stuff this season, so I like the levity being mixed up here. But we are going to get next episode, it looks like a kind of like heist sequence, which I always enjoy. Heists are always tons of fun. So Star Trek getting to do a heist sequence is always a real big joy. In fact, my favorite episode of last season of Picard was Stardust City Rag, which is also a kind of pseudo heist episode as well. So hopefully that continues to play out in this next episode. And also, I should say, the song that the gala band was playing when they arrived was "Fly Me to the Moon," the name of the episode, which is very appropriate in terms of the just topics. Like, "Fly Me to the Moon," I'll be among the stars. Like, it fits the themes of Star Trek and everything going on here. So good usage of that. But I believe that is everything that I had for this discussion of this episode. So did you have any thoughts on this episode? Do you want to praise me for getting finally a Star Trek lore bit right? You don't praise me, please don't. But seriously, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode. I am still loving this season so far. The improvement between season 1 and 2 of Picard has just me so ecstatic and happy. I am so pleased with this show so far. And while I understand some of the criticisms, and I do understand there are some things to criticize, like butterfly stuff that characters don't really care about, or the pacing, for example, I am personally just very much enjoying every bit of this show for the most part. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, though, down in the comments below. But beyond all of that, thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper, my friends.